Mikhail Viktorovich, please give a description of the definition of Russian. Does a Russian person understand his connection with various neighboring peoples? Or does the so-called carrier of Russianness include only the indigenous inhabitants of the indicated on the map territories?
Well, in general, each person understands the word Russian in his own way. Therefore, there is a very wide spectrum of opinions about who are Russians and who are not Russians. And these opinions are sometimes mutually exclusive. Let's just look at the historical development. Once upon a time in the 19th century, there was such a definition that a Russian is an Orthodox person. This definition in that historical era was indeed life consistent within the boundaries of the Russian Empire. Because representatives of other nationalities professed, as a rule, other religions. Everyone was a native speaker of the Russian language, but the Great Russians, Little Russians, and Belarusians, they were for the most part Orthodox. Atheists, there were one or two, you could count them on the fingers. There were also one or two people of other faiths who could be counted on the fingers. In addition, leaving orthodoxy in those days was corpus delicti. Well, if one of these so-called foreigners converted to orthodoxy, then this was encouraged, and he was considered a fully fledged Russian person. And in general, this is how the country lived before 1917. After 1917, there was a lot of many things, and there were many things that were, well, simply idiotic, stupid. Because, for example, my father was Russian before 1932. After 1932, he became a Ukrainian. Moreover, he was confronted with this fact on the grounds that, or rather on the contrary, he was Ukrainian until 1932, and after 1932 he became Russian. Because in 1932 the Soviet army carried out a reconciliation of personal files, and his grandmother was Russian. And therefore his father from the Ukrainians, since his grandfather was Ukrainian, became Russian simply on the basis of a formal bureaucratic order, when in the Soviet army, in accordance with the traditions of Judaism, when reconciling personal files, everyone's nationality was recorded by mother. Well, such is the story. Although, if we turn to what was before 1917, then he would have been a little Russian, most likely of the Orthodox faith, if there had not been an event by the name of the Great October Socialist Revolution and further on. Then, in the Soviet Union, nationality began to be recorded arbitrarily. So there arose with us very exotic nationalities there, or rather it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was proclaimed that everyone has the right to determine their nationality themselves. But besides the fact that everyone himself has the right to recognize his nationality on his own, there is also an external recognition or non-recognition of the declaration of one's nationality. And on this basis, in general, conflicts often arise because a person considers himself Russian and others deny his being Russian. Or he himself denies other people's belonging to Russians. Well, if we turn to broader views, then let's look at the psychology of the individual and try to classify his interests. Well, we can single out the first group of interests. These are exclusively individual, consumer everyday, and hedonistic interests. That is, this is everything that fits into the words, I want everything to be good for me. Further, we have family everyday interests. The next group is narrow professional interests. These three groups of interests are in no way connected with nationality or anything else. They are apolitical, they are characteristic of all people to this or that measure, and this is so. The next group of interests. These are interests conditioned by class belonging. In the 19th century, Marx, Engels pointed this out, and then Lenin, Stalin supported this. And yes, indeed, such an approach has the right to exist, because the subcultures of different classes are different. They form the psyche of people in different ways. Further, there are interests conditioned by nationality. But what is at the basis of these interests? First of all, mother tongue. When we master a language, we master not only words, but we master a certain system of images, understandings that stand behind these words, are expressed in these words. We master certain Nravia standards that connect words and images understandings well and determine world perception. Therefore, you can't get away from this. After all, if we talk about the national identity of a person, then everything starts from the native language. Next come confessionally conditioned interests. Confessionally conditioned interests. This is already cultural specifics, because there are people for whom Russian is their native language. But if we talk about confessional interests, then someone considers himself to be a Jew, for example, Vladimir Rudolfovich Solovyov, someone an Orthodox, someone a Marxist by persuasion, although Marxism is listed as a science, but in fact it is, after all, a confession. Because a lot of what is unproven is accepted on faith or rejected on faith. So there is also this. Further, there are interests conditioned by the fact that we live in the same state. This is also a certain circle of interests. Yes, in the state, in some way, class and confessionally conditioned interests are refracted, but nonetheless, state-conditioned interests, interests of a statewide scale, they also exist. Further, global civilization is humanity. It is represented by a certain number of regional civilizations. Well, the largest regional civilizations are the West. At the basis lies the Bible. The Muslim world. Yes, it is heterogeneous, but still, the culture of both the Shiites and Sunnis is based on the Quran. The Vedic East, India, suprastructural, China, Japan, since there is Buddhism, its own local beliefs, but that also have taken shape in historical development, and there are also their own interests. And there is Russia. Russia, in her historical development, well, she is like an accordion. Now huge territories, now she shrinks to the size of the Principality of Moscow, then she expands again, absorbing in herself many peoples. The Russian language becomes for many peoples either their native language or a second native language, because bilingualism for many is also characteristic. And here it turns out that people, depending on the interests of which groups they carry in themselves, they perceive differently both the word Russian and Russia as a word and as a socio-cultural phenomenon, as a territory on a map. And if we, after all, recognize the existence of these groups of interests, plus the interests of a global scale, then, depending on which groups of interests are excluded from the world understanding of a person, from his activity, he will give different definitions of the term Russian. Now, if we recognize all 9 groups of interests and carry them to some extent, that is, there are interests of a global civilizational scale, there are interests of a regional civilizational scale, there are interests of a statewide scale, further, confessional, national, and then here are the 3 groups of apolitical interests, exclusively individual, family everyday, and narrowly professional. Then, in general, we can give the most complete answer to the theme of what is Russian only from the position of all 9 groups of interest. And it will be life consistent, because Russia, this is one of the regional civilizations, and at the same time, she is a state. A state that is characterized by the fact that one of the regional civilizations more or less completely lies within its borders. And this state culture, it is common to all peoples who live in this state. But if you look at our history, then in the sphere of governance, yes, it changed organizationally more than once, but nonetheless, in the sphere of governance there were representatives of all peoples who lived within the borders of this state. If someone was not there, it was not because the paths were closed, but because in the historical development they did not manage to generate those people who would enter the structure, or they did not want to. Well, for example, the Central Asian peoples became a part of the Russian Empire in the second half of the 19th century. They simply did not have enough time for their representatives to enter the imperial elite. After the partitions of Poland, the Poles were divided. Some were against the Russian Empire, while others who were prosperous integrated into Russian culture and contributed to its development. That is, this is history. It is multifaceted and in some respects paradoxical. The Soviet period, it was generally characterized by the fact that they took care that representatives of all peoples would be represented in the sphere of power and science, and sometimes even pulled by the ears. Although in their historical development these or those peoples had not reached such a level that their representatives possessed the knowledge and skills that would allow them to fully participate in all union affairs. And again, when I say about this, I'm not talking about the fact that someone is biologically inferior. I'm talking about the fact that all peoples follow their own historical paths of development, and therefore, such formal equality as equality of skills, equality of knowledge, opportunities, it does not exist. But nonetheless, it is gradually being worked out. And it can be worked out according to two models. Like in the USA, a melting pot, we erase all national differences and get something incomprehensible there. Or in the Russian model of development, multinational, which accepts everything, and everything can develop in a common to all culture, in a common to all state, enriching both the common culture and the culture of other peoples with something of their own. Therefore, if we talk about Russianness, then Russianness is belonging to a regional civilization. This regional civilization is organized within the borders of one state. Yes, these borders move around in historical development, as a result of which sometimes they shrink, sometimes they expand, but the general tendency is such that over the last 1,000 years, 2,000 years, the borders of the state have become more and more extensive. And this regional civilization has absorbed the peoples of other regional civilizations. Therefore, the question arises of how regional civilizations differ from each other. This question, it is especially relevant in our time, when, well, the technosphere in many countries is common. Trans-state trade has developed in the last few decades, and, in general, economic globalization, it is such that the 21st century differs from the 19th century in that the 19th century, the bulk of the population used what was produced within the borders of their state, and sometimes their own economy. The 21st century is characterized by the fact that we use what is produced all over the world. And this creates the illusion that the world is becoming a large global village, where everyone seems to know everything about each other, everything is open, and national identity is losing relevance, going away into a certain past, and the result, allegedly, a certain common people. Nevertheless, this view is incorrect, and if we talk about the differences between regional civilizations, then they are characterized not by the historically taken shape way of their life, not by the technosphere that they developed or did not develop, or borrowed from others. Dostoevsky wrote that every people is characterized by what it dreams of, that is, by ideals. Real life can be very far from ideals and can be close to ideals. Because if we talk, let's say, about the regional civilization of the West, well, they expressed a certain ideal in their time. In Protestantism, and they were able to build a way of life in which these ideals are more or less achieved. How did it turn out on a global scale? On a global scale, there turned out a global biospheric social and ecological crisis, which can kill all of humanity, and not just the West. And there turned out a biological degeneration of the population within the boundaries of the West, followed by a cultural degradation. If we talk about Russia, then the ideals of Russia have always been spravedlivost. And spravedlivost is also a very specific, mystical word. Because prav is the laws to which life is subject. If the ancient Slavic terms yav, prav, nav are translated into modern scientific terminology, then yav is a reality. Nav is the memory of the universe, the memory of the earth. And prav is a system of governance. Therefore, spravedlivost is something that proceeds from objective laws, to which the life of people must be subordinated. So, Russia, when she says that her ideals are spravedlivost, moreover, spravedlivost not only in her society, but spravedlivost on a global scale, then this is a certain ideal that has its own foundation, regularities, objective laws of the being of all that is in creation. Objective laws in the aggregate, this is what is called God's predetermination of being. And again, remember that the first ship of the line, built by Peter I, was called Goto Predestinatia, divine predetermination. The remake is in Voronezh, in a museum. One can go and see it. But these kinds of things, they are not accidental. If we turn to the West, then one of the most popular names of ships in the English-speaking world is Enterprise. That is, something that comes from oneself. And from oneself, a lot of different things can come. There can be agreement with providence and predetermination, and Satanism can come, which opposes providence and predetermination of being. Therefore, in such an understanding, spravedlivost, yes. But if we talk about the life of Russia, then, in general, we grind up various kinds of non-spravedlivost. And, in general, the crisis of global civilization arranged by the West, it requires an alternative project of globalization. Judging by what is happening in the world, no one but us can offer this alternative project of globalization. We can offer it. We have it. The conception of social safety found its expression in the words of the Russian language, not English or any other. But again, from the point of view of many who consider themselves Russian, this is not a Russian project. But everyone has the right to think so. Well, let him think about the circle of interests and those groups of interests that are part of his circle of interests, and think about what to do with this global crisis. Because there are very cool Russian nationalists who believe that the global crisis of the era up to the present day is the result, as they say, of the night of Svarog, which is nearing completion. But when Svarog, the creator of the universe, wakes up, then he will put things in order. But they, for some reason, don't think that if Svarog wakes up, then the first thing that will happen in putting things in order will be the question to them: why, while I was sleeping, did you allow such a disgrace? And they will have to answer for everything that they did on this night of Svarog, with their connivance of unpraviousness, referring it to the night of Svarog. Because in the marine mentality, this variant does not work. The ship is operated on a long voyage on a watch basis, and not a single watch has the right to govern the ship unpreviously or evade the performance of official duties. Therefore, the question of Russianness, it is such: if we understand that the earth is mother, that man is God's steward on earth, that he is responsible for the blago arrangement of this created by God blagorious world, and works selflessly for this, then he is Russian. If he has a desire to shirk the mission of global responsibility and concern for the planet, then no matter what he says, he is only Russian-speaking. Further, there arises the question of biology and culture. Yes, biologically all peoples are different. Why? Well, because different living conditions, because the flow of mutations, because culture is also a factor of the environment to which genetics adapts in a certain way. Well, all this difference is multiformity, and it should organically form a single multinational humanity, within which there is social harmony, and which lives in harmony with the biosphere. This is what Russianness is. And if you don't like it, then from the position of such Russianness, this is Russian-speakingness. What are the prospects for Russian-speakingness? Well, someone will come to their senses and become Russian. Someone will not come to his senses, and if he violates the objective laws of being, even in full accordance with all the law-making insanity that is generated by the legislative power in all countries and international institutions, then he will slurp a full spoonful of retribution for the violation of these objective laws. Since the principle, ignorance of the law, does not exempt from retribution, from consequences, it works not only in jurisprudence, but, by and large, life is not revenge for these or those well, true, offenses in a broader sense than the juridical sense. It is an unreasoning impact from above. If a person is unreasoned, then God is not vindictive, and everything will be fine. But if he is not unreasoned, then there may be problems connected with the fact that the given individual or the carriers of the given culture do not justify the hopes that God placed on them. If they do not justify, then they are usurpers of being, and they go into non-being in one way or the other. They become part of the Nav, the memory of the universe, because they did not fit into the Prav, being in Yav. That's in general everything on this theme, if in the form of a monologue.
Is the conception of social safety connected with the knowledge of the wolves? Are there cultural parallels?
You see, if we talk about the conception of social safety, then it is not connected with the Vedic culture. The conception of social safety is one of the expressions of the One Testament. That is, Moses, Christ, Muhammad, others, they taught one and the same thing in different eras, in different languages. The essence of this teaching is simple. God is one, God is the creator and all holder, man is the steward of God on earth, people live according to your Sobornost. Everything else will be good if you live according to your Sobornost. If we talk about some secret knowledge, then the very question of secretness, of concealment of knowledge, in general, is also enforced. Because in order for a person to carry out the mission of God's stewardship on earth, he must be competent, at least in the area for which he has taken responsibility. In addition, he must be competent in related areas because his activities exert some impact on other areas. And, in addition, his activities are largely conditioned by the achievements that are in other areas. This is a real fact. Further, such an opinion is put forward that knowledge must be withheld in order to avoid abuse of it. Well, let's look at history. History is a continuous abuse of this or that knowledge. If we remember the movie The Fifth Element, then the young lady refuses to save humanity, looking at this history. That is, the conception of hiding knowledge in order to avoid abuse of it is not confirmed by historical practice. The question arises, what is it actually needed for then? It is needed in order to implement the principle everyone, to the measure of understanding, works for himself, and to the measure of non-understanding, for those who understand more. And accordingly, if there are carriers of knowledge that others do not possess, then a system of non-zero-sum games is formed. When the carriers of knowledge win in any case, and everyone else depends on them. Therefore, all this hiddenness of knowledge, this is an instrument of slavery. And the fact that the Vedic culture set foot on the path of hiding knowledge, it was this that conditioned its impasse and collapse. Because if we talk about perfect knowledge, then perfect knowledge is characterized by the fact that it cannot be abused, otherwise it would not be perfect. But if perfect knowledge that cannot be abused is expelled from culture, then a socio-cultural environment is created in which abuse is inevitable. Because if we put perfect knowledge into children, then by the time they acquire applied knowledge that can be abused, they are formed as personalities for whom the abuse of knowledge is disgusting. For them, this is simply unacceptable in life, de facto. And they will behave in life in accordance with the Quranic recommendation: eliminate evil with what is best. If perfect knowledge is expelled from culture, then everything is like this. Then there is formed the pair: exoteric culture, this is everything for everyone, and an esoteric subculture, multi-layered, where knowledge is dosed, skills are dosed, and those who are at the top of the subculture, especially if they belong to this subculture in the continuity of generations, then, when they grow up, they generally have nothing to talk about with commoners. And this situation cannot be changed instantaneously by historical standards. This situation can only be changed as a result of social development, in which the personal development of everyone is a contribution to the development of society as a whole. Then the creative potential of everyone is an all people's property, and the suppression of the creative potential of everyone is a betrayal of the motherland. Therefore, those who advertise tobacco, beer, other drinks, drugs, those who work for the perversion of the system of education, for the primitivization of education, these are all traitors. Even if they have authority, they are in power, they are considered authorities. The crowd hangs on their words when they pronounce all sorts of things with claims to scholarship and knowledge. Nevertheless, they are traitors to their homeland.
Does there also exist a transfer of the ideals of Spravедливость in the world arrangement between generations of the inhabitants of our country?
It does. This is not a characteristic of the main statistical mass. Because, after all, if it were a characteristic of the main statistical mass, we would still be living in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would be the only superpower. But, nonetheless, the genetic core of the Russian multinational civilization, it exists. It reproduces itself in the continuity of generations, and it determines the future of Russia, of the world, regardless of the fact that the main statistical mass of the population of the planet behaves in a way that is unworthy of a person to behave. The film Planet of the Apes, the whole series in general, it could have been shot without makeup at all. If you remember previously, sense previously, think previously, then you can act previously. If you act previously, then there will be a transformation of the whole earth. There will take place the formation of a civilization of humanness, when viewed from which the current problems will be perceived as all sorts of sores in the childhood of humanness. But for this, it is necessary to work. Those who want to wait for a good time, they should remember the words of Nekrasov. The ones who will live in this beautiful time will not be you and will not be I. Because if you live in the mode, live now, live for the present, then nothing good will happen. But if you live always and live in the present, then everything will be good. But there is a difference between living for the present and living in the present, living always. Therefore, it is necessary to live always, but in the present.